Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, just got back from a retreat the last 4 days, and I didn't have too much time to doodle on this today, but what I'm thinking about is the relationship between people will say something like a right perspective on God leads towards a well-ordered life. And when your life is ordered correctly, then that would be like a sort of recognition of God or of abundance, or things just get more clear and make sense. And that's been my experience. And so what I've been dwelling on in relation to that is you have God, who is this all-sustaining, all magnificent presence, basically, which created existence and sustains it in each individual moment. And so what does it mean to love God, heart, mind, body, and soul? And I'm not sure how I got from there to basically God is the source of love. So if love is such a scattered thing, God is the source of love. So if God comes from, if we come from God and love comes from God, then the directionality of all of it is to recognize that the source of love is coming from God, is coming from this infinite source of goodness. And then that flows out through us individually out to the people we touch in our lives, and represented a different way is that God is, you could say, in us in a sense, but he's in and beyond us, and his love then flows out through us as we are a vessel for that love. In the end of the Psalm 23 passages, and surely I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And I was thinking about how that relates to dwelling in this place of infinite love. And so whenever you're dwelling in, resting in God's presence, or the ground of the being of all of reality, which is God, which is good, then you can most fully be embodying that love in the world. And the true embodiment of that love is Jesus Christ. And so I'm not sure how I got to the next part, but I was thinking about how self relates to this, and how people often say that the ultimate truth transcends all the stories, that there can't be any story, especially in the Eastern or New Age perspectives. And so I was thinking about how this relates to what the practices are, and how people in Buddhism will talk about the mind-heart balance and moving into heartfulness, or the heart-mind. And you have these practices of emptying, you could say, or seeing through the insight of truth of no self. And so you have this kind of path of thinking that the truth is within, and then moving down and recognizing that ultimately there's no self, and or the self is illusory, and the world is illusory in some dreamlike sense as well, and ultimately that it's all one thing, the non-dual realization. Whereas in the West, you have more of a specific object of meditation, whether it's the Bible or Scripture or love or goodness, Jesus Christ. And there's a path moving up towards a closeness to God, but not necessarily a union or a dissolution into God, or the insight that you don't exist and only God exists, or something like that. So thinking about how these two relate, where essentially the path of man working its way up to God, sort of is climbing this ladder through meditating more, coming to insight, coming to yogic realizations, the yoga of union, climbing up on man's efforts. And so you see something like Isha Yoga, that's like You meditate ultimately like 7 hours a day, starting at 3 a.m., and maybe you'll have some liberation moment where you'll find freedom, ultimate freedom. And similarly, for people that are meditating for years and years and years. Whereas the difference is that through Christ, God is reaching down to man and lifting man up. And so there's a salvation first, and then the recognition of moving down a path of sanctification where you're not losing anything in terms of self or world. And so I was thinking about how that relates that with the mind and reason and rationality, because you get in the Eastern path, you'll get sort of the saying that there's no self ultimately, or that there's no enduring self-essence, or whatever else is said, or that the world is ultimately illusion. And it seems to me this could be seen as kind of hacking the brain to essentially cut off the storyline. So you create this separation between the mind, where you recognize that the heart is the primary experience, that there's only this moment, there's only love. And in doing that, you create a sort of guardrails that pushes you into the experiential truth of love, which is this sort of, people say, well, it'll be a non-dual experience. But the problem is then you have to also live in a world where you've said that the self is illusion and the world is illusion. So you're tossing out the story, the story piece. And then that would explain why you have people saying that the only truth is God and the world's illusion, and like in Hinduism and Buddhism. But what if we could have both, where you have the love, the all-inclusive love of the heart of God, and you have the reason of the mind? And I was thinking about how this relates to mercy and justice, where, God is ultimately all loving, but justice makes distinctions between good and bad and right and wrong. And you have the East sort of talking into this in terms of karma, where you'll have some judgment whenever you die and you'll reincarnate in some sense, but then who's making the decision of how karma works out? Like who says what's good or bad in that sense? So this gets into the world of moral goods, rights and wrongs, and the use of the intellect or to discover. And I mean, we use the intellect all the time. So this is an interesting kind of exploration and thought process, where instead of tossing out the world and the self and the soul, the benefits of the Christian path is that you're maintaining the reasoning, where you recognize that the self, your community, the world is all grounded in God and all sustaining sustainer of existence. And so then you get the benefit of maintaining selfhood, having structure around community such as the church, and having a call to service in the world, these are all very deep parts of Christianity. When you have them sort of, it seems like, and I need to do more research, but it seems like there's a leaking of these traits into Buddhism and Hinduism, but they're ultimately incoherent, because they're saying the ultimate truth is that there's no self and the world is illusion. So if the world's illusion and you're cutting through all desire, then it leads to an incoherence. So I think what I'm getting at is there's obviously a truth in the experience of love and the experience of creation being good. But if you toss out the self and the world in achieving that, then it's going to be just a misstep, or only a partial truth. And I think this is the meaning of Jesus coming in the form of a man, of God coming in the form of a man in Jesus, that you get both embodiment in the world, in family, in community, and a connection to infinite love, which is God. So that's what I'm thinking about right now. Need to hash out some thinking on not really thinking, but research on some of actually what's being said in the Buddhist and Hindu contexts, and probably Sufi contexts, and Jainism, and all of that. Yeah, that's the thinking for the day, and hope you enjoyed. Look forward to seeing how it unfolds, and be well.